Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'd like to welcome you to the Campfire Chat organized by the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative on the topic of Marine Cloud Brightening. Today we have three amazing people to share their experience and, more importantly, their different perspectives on these issues. In a few moments, I will ask them to introduce themselves. But for now, first, let me just apologize. Some of our speakers had to rise very early. Others will get to bed late because of the time zone differences when we're trying to connect people across the globe. Now, the idea of this session is to have a discussion around the virtual campfire. The idea is not to have long speeches and presentations, but to have discussion and then to have opportunity for question and answers with the participants. Let me start perhaps by introducing myself. My name is Janos Pasztor. I'm the Executive Director of the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. I've been doing this since middle of 2016. Before that, I was in the United Nations. My last position was Assistant Secretary General for Climate Change, working under Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Before that, I worked in various United Nations and also non-governmental organizations, including the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UN Environment Programme, the Worldwide Fund for Nature, WWF, and a number of other entities. But basically, I've been working on climate change and sustainable development for pretty much the last 4 decades. And as we all know, the climate is not in a very good situation. And I have 3 grandchildren, and I feel I owe them to continue to contribute to the unfinished business of reducing the climate crisis. And I hope that with this discussion today, we can contribute to that. Now, may I ask my colleagues to also turn on their video and join us. Louise to start with, then John, and then Anna Maria. Louise, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Sure, I'm Louise Sales and I coordinate Friend Tech projects. So we campaign for a precautionary approach to emerging technologies, which include geoengineering.
Thank you. John, could you say a few words about yourself?
Sure. I'm John Shepard. I'm Emeritus Professor of System Science at the University of Southampton. I've worked on a fairly wide range of environmental problems during my career, but I'm basically an oceanographer who is very interested in and very concerned about climate change. And I chaired the Royal Society's study on geoengineering the climate just over 10 years ago, and have been taking an interest in the subject ever since. And I'm actually co-chair of an organization called the Solar Radiation Management Governance Initiative, which aims to disseminate knowledge and improve knowledge in the developing world about these emerging technologies.
Thank you, John. Anna Maria.
Hi, my name is Anna Maria Hubert. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Calgary, Faculty of Law, and an associate fellow at the Institute for Science, Innovation and Society at the University of Oxford. And my research is in the area of public international law, so international environmental law, law of the sea, a little bit of human rights law as well. And so I've been working on the topic of climate engineering for a while. I was part of I was a postdoc in the interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary research group at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, and I also led a research project between the University of Oxford and the IASS Potsdam on the governance of scientific research related to climate engineering specifically.
Thank you, Anna Maria, and thank you also. We have a great group to discuss these issues. Maybe just to continue, let me say a few words about the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative that is hosting this event, C2G. We're funded entirely from philanthropy. We're just a small group of 16 people working virtually, even before COVID, on 3 continents. And we have a very simple mission to catalyze the creation of effective governance for these new approaches that can alter the climate, focusing in particular on large-scale carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification. We are impartial about the use or not of these technologies, or which technologies, which approaches to use. Those are societal questions, and we don't feel that we need to be engaged in those. But one part of our strategy is to encourage learning through conversations like we have in this C2GLearn exercise, and in particular these Campfire Chats. We have some 50 experts that we have managed to bring together in different parts of the C2GLearn process. Now, the purpose of this event is to actually show that there is a diversity of views. We hope that our guests, Louise, John, and Anna Maria, will express their perspectives on the different issues, and then we'll discuss them. Obviously, in a small campfire chat like this, we cannot have 20, 30 people, and therefore it is always impossible to bring together all the relevant perspectives, because there are usually more than 2, 3, or 4. We try, and we aim for the best coverage in terms of geographical, gender, and socio-political perspective. On the whole, I think we're managing quite well when you look at the totality of the C2GLearn process, but of course, we can't achieve that at every single event. So I look forward to the discussion. Again, the idea is to have an exchange, not to convince each other, not to come to a conclusion that this is the way to go forward, but to understand how different people may have different perspectives. A few words about the topic today, marine cloud brightening, as part of overall solar radiation modification. And maybe first, just a very quick word on terminology without getting into the details, but we already heard different colleagues referring to different terminology. We try to follow the IPCC terminology to the extent we can. So we talk about solar radiation modification as the overarching group of approaches within which one finds marine cloud brightening. Others call it solar radiation management, or solar geoengineering, or climate engineering. There are different ways to express. And I just wanted to mention that, but just to be clear that we're all talking about the same issues. Now, I don't think that any of us who are participating in this discussion, we need to spend too much time on how serious a situation we're in terms of climate change. The impacts are clear everywhere, whether it's excess heat in the Arctic, in certain cities in the world, forest fires, you name it, the impacts are clear. And even the IPCC's special report on 1.5 degree and other reports before it as well have made it clear that emission reductions must go into super turbocharged mode to reduce global emissions as soon as possible. But even under the most optimistic emission reduction scenarios, we will need some kind of carbon dioxide removal, and which ones and when, that's another debate. Some scientists say that even that may not be enough, and we may need to look for solar radiation modification approaches. And the purpose of today's discussion is not to focus whether or not we need them, but if societies were to consider to do or not to do these, what are some of the governance challenges related to one set of approaches, the marine cloud brightening. And this is a very simple technology. I'm sure we'll talk about it, to create essentially clouds above the ocean to reflect sunlight back to space that would then cool that particular region. Could it work? If yes, how and what governance issues arise? There are some recent experiments we've seen worldwide, particularly in Australia, and others are being planned. So it's relevant and appropriate to have this kind of a discussion. And indeed, we hope that the discussion will bring up some of the key governance challenges that we'll have to address in this area. So Now, what I'd like to do is to get into the actual exchange and in terms of the mechanics, the participants. So I will start off the discussion by asking each speaker to say in 2 or 3 minutes a few key points that they would like to address from their perspective, just to get the discussion going. Then we'll spend 20 minutes or so, maybe a little longer, to have a discussion within the 3 guest speakers that we have. And then we will open up to questions from the participants. And you're welcome to pose your questions already now or during the discussion in the Q&A tab of the Zoom functionality. Please note that there is a like button there. So if there's a question that is already posed and you like it, then that will give it a higher chance that we'll deal with it if there are many questions. So please put your question and vote for other questions that are there. There's also a chat box. You're welcome to chat if you like, but don't put your questions in the chat box because we may miss that during the discussion. So I will now stop. This is enough to get us going. And I would like to start by asking our guests to say in 2-3 minutes some key points. And maybe I'd like to start in the Western Hemisphere, very far from where I am now, Anna Maria. There does not seem to be any international law governing marine cloud brightening, global or regional. Do you think that marine cloud brightening actually warrants a specific governance process or treaty? And if yes, how would you characterize such a treaty? And what arguments would you put forward in agreement or disagreement with either of these options that you may come up with? Please.
I'm tempted to start with just a blanket disclaimer that lawyers normally start with, well, it depends.
We'll follow up that one later, okay?
That way, I like always answer student questions. So on the one hand, I guess I want to challenge the premise of the question. And when you look at, and there have been surveys of applicable at least relevant international law, we have a suite of norms, both customary and treaty-based, that are potentially relevant to marine cloud brightening techniques. And so on the one hand, we actually have a problem where we may have either a congestion of norms or fragmentation across them. And where you choose to place this issue within existing legal instruments and institutions may be significant in terms of how the issue is governed. And so, for example, one possible framework is under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. More specifically, there has been some suggestion that we could call this adaptation. Well, then we bring marine cloud brightening within an existing framework, and it reframes the issue as one where we need to increase ambition, have reporting requirements. Article 6 of the Paris Agreement talks about cooperation on these issues and so forth. And that's very different than, for example, if we treated it under the law of the sea. So the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea includes obligations, including a positive obligation to protect and preserve the marine environment, including from all sources of marine pollution. The question, emissions or warming, it could be a kind of energy which falls within the convention's definition of pollution. And so here there may in fact be a positive obligation to protect the marine environment. If we look at the rule on transboundary harm, which is customary in international law and binds all parties, we have a very different framework than the CBD and so forth. At the same time, there are gaps in all of these frameworks. And so there, I think, calls for governance of solar radiation modification techniques generally and marine cloud brightening specifically are required, including on cooperation and coordination of the research. At least that's my view. So one of the questions here, if I may just go on a little further.
Please do.
One of the questions was whether we need a bespoke treaty for marine cloud brightening. And I think, well, my view is at least, and it's hard to know how this issue will develop, but certainly not now is my view. And there are a number of legal and other reasons for saying that. We've done very little research on these techniques. We know a bit, but certainly not very much. Treaty making is an extremely resource-intensive process to have these kinds of multilateral negotiations. It's hard to see that there would be any political will for that at the moment, given where the international agenda is at and the kinds of topics that are on it now, and the general pull away from multilateralism that we've seen from certain countries. Treaties have a number of other potential drawbacks, such as because countries would be legally bound, they're more likely to water down the stringency of commitments. You may get less participation, and so the big players may not even sign on and be committed at all, and so forth. And I think all of this is to say that, I mean, the advantage of treaties, maybe I should say that right at the end, is that of course you have a legally binding document that binds those parties who have agreed to commit themselves to these issues. But I think all of this to say is that some of the political issues have not been sufficiently discussed and negotiated. So I think the policy is still lagging, and also the sort of broad political participation in the discussion. It's taking place in certain countries. So we've seen a little bit of work being done in Australia, where there was an experiment in the outdoor environment. But yeah, I think more discussion and participation and political guidance would be helpful before we launched into lawmaking, because it might end up that you have something that's not really fit for purpose at all.
Okay, so not yet, but maybe after this Campfire Chat, we can start the lawmaking, right? No, but can I just?
I think it really jumps ahead, because like, I don't really know that people across the globe are really in favor of these approaches at all. And so we have to also consider that, I mean, there can be an enabling function of elaborating governance and locking it in. And so there's a risk that you preempt important civil society and political discussion at different levels.
Before going on to our next call, can I just ask you on one specific issue? You mentioned a couple of multilateral processes, and I think we all share with you how difficult it is to negotiate things, and certainly new treaties. But what about regional level?
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to think about a little bit about what applies there. Yeah, there are regional seas agreements, for example, if we put it under the frame of oceans, for example. I think, I mean, it depends on how this is scaled and how it develops. So a lot of people are saying, oh, it's just a sort of local measure for protecting certain features, marine features or interests. And certainly it might start that way, but if every or many countries in the world do a significant amount of marine cloud brightening, the question is, what kind of larger effects will that have on the climate? And if that's uncoordinated, what are the risks of a patchwork approach? And I think certainly the existing legal framework supports countries undertaking activities within national jurisdiction and having a lot of say over the control. But that could have a lot of chaotic effects on the climate system, or generally, at least that's my understanding. I would defer to Professor Shepard on that point. But
okay, well, we may come back to some of these. Let's go on, and I'd like to turn to John now. And John, it does appear that marine cloud brightening could be used in a local or regional manner, as opposed to something like stratospheric aerosol injection, which is much more global, if not completely global. Also, it seems that marine cloud brightening can be perhaps done for a short period of time, in a burst, as opposed to, again, stratospheric aerosol injection, that it could be that would need to be done on a much longer time period. So what sort of governance challenges do you see from your perspective in relation to these potentially different approaches to cooling?
Yes, well, you're absolutely right. And I think it leads directly into what Anna Maria just said about the potential problems of a patchwork approach. Because one of the interesting scientific issues that arises is that clouds are, of course, very powerful actors in the climate system. If you have a cloud come across the sun, you can reduce the incoming radiation by hundreds of watts per meter squared in seconds. And that's a very powerful forcing, and that happens naturally, of course. But if you do it deliberately and systematically, you are applying a potentially very strong forcing in a localized area. And that's exactly what drives weather systems. I mean, ultimately, that's what causes hurricanes. Strong heating in a localized area causes hurricanes. Strong cooling almost certainly won't produce a hurricane or anything like it because of the way the atmosphere works. But it's still a strong effect. And this, I think, in one sense, that can be a good thing. And in another sense, it can be a bad thing. So yes, you can probably confine the impacts of what you're doing to a relatively restricted area, which may be a good thing. But on the other hand, it won't be completely localized. There will be teleconnections and regional impacts. And as Anna Maria says, if a lot of people do it in different places, you're applying strong and uncoordinated forcing to the atmospheric system. And to be honest, that is a very frightening prospect. So I think the fact that it's local is not really very comforting to me, because it does mean that people might try and do this within their own exclusive economic zones and think, well, that's okay, we don't have to consult anybody. And yet there could be regional effects. They could affect the tracks of the jet streams. They could shift the intertropical convergence zone in certain areas. They could affect the monsoons. And they could do all sorts of things that other people outside their economic zones would care about a lot. So I would say, if this is ever going to be used, it will need proper governance. It's not something that can be left to national governments. It will certainly need to be regional, but the trouble with regional approaches is that there are always gaps between the regions. Some background in fisheries management, as some of you may know, and there are good regional treaties that cover certain areas, and there are gaps between them. Things that go by the name of the donut hole, for example, where there is no relevant international jurisdiction, and all sorts of bad things go on. So I would be very much more comfortable if we had a global approach to this problem. And you asked about a bespoke treaty. I think a bespoke treaty for marine cloud brightening all on its own would be a very poor idea, and we can probably discuss that in some depth later. But it would be much more comforting if we were working within a framework. And there's a very curious thing, because for the sea, curiously, we have very good international frameworks. We have a United Nations Law of the Sea. We have the London Dumping Convention. If anybody tries to go and do anything stupid in the sea, we have international organizations and mechanisms in place that would do something about it. In the case of the atmosphere, that's simply not true. So I would say no to a bespoke treaty for marine cloud brightening, but I would be very interested in a UN law of the atmosphere to cover stratospheric aerosols and marine cloud brightening and sulfur dioxide and anything else you can think of. I think that's a missing piece of the Rio package that was negotiated back in the 90s. And it's about time that we thought about filling in the missing pieces of the Rio treaties and making them more comprehensive.
That's very interesting, John. Can I just ask you one more step? But this Anna Maria, were you interested in coming in as well?
Well, I guess
please do if you want. Yes.
Yeah. No, it's true. When you look at the law of the sea, we have an umbrella agreement with the 1982 Convention on the Law of the Sea that provides a sort of almost constitutional structure for the development of all issues related to the sea, including the protection of the environment. And within this sort of broad constitutional framework, we've seen elaboration of specific treaties. And so it has a sort of natural framework that allows for sort of legal developments, but to occur in a more coordinated fashion. And it's also true that we don't have a law of the atmosphere. There has been some discussion of developing this since the 90s, sort of like a coordinated law of the atmosphere. So we have ozone and we have climate and we have transboundary harm. And these are all regulated under different kinds of concepts and frameworks under international law. And so a few years ago, the International Law Commission, which is a UN body established by the UN General Assembly in 1947, which has a mandate to initiate studies and make recommendations related to the progressive development of the law, launched a study on the protection of the atmosphere and whether, which sort of related to this idea of developing a law of the atmosphere. And if you even look at the mandate of that work, it was significantly cut back. States really didn't seem super keen to undertake this project. So I guess I would say, don't hold your breath on a coordinated law of the atmosphere, even though that might be desirable from a normative standpoint. But it is interesting because that work did examine international law related to geoengineering. And there is a draft recommendation. I'm sorry, I'm just looking at now. So the study looked at issues related to geoengineering and the legal limits on intentional modification of the atmosphere. And these guidelines are now at the stage of integrating comments by governments, at least last time I checked. And so draft guideline 7 says intentional large-scale modification of the atmosphere and activities aimed at intentional large-scale modification of the atmosphere should be conducted with prudence and caution, subject to any applicable rules of international law. So it really doesn't.
Looks like we have the way forward, right?
It's like, oh, like, yeah, we knew that. Maybe the prudence and caution is significant. They don't apply the precautionary principle even in these, they sort of ignore, say, well, the precautionary principle doesn't have the legal status of customary international law, but prudence and caution is perhaps code for precaution there.
Before going on to Louise, just 1.5 questions. Well, 2 questions, but one definitely to John, and the other one either of you. But John, you mentioned quite a bit of the potential impacts of marine cloud brightening, sort of happening at, even if it's a relatively local level, it will have impacts on weather patterns and so on. Maybe you could just go a little bit more in depth of what these various potential negative impacts. I mean, I presume the positive impact is that there will be cooling, so we don't need to talk about that. But in terms of the potential negative impacts, that would be helpful, I think, for this discussion. And then either of you, since you raised it, John, but Anna Maria, you obviously have some thoughts about it, but is where would such a discussion belong to have a global law of the atmosphere? Is there a place? Does it have to go to the General Assembly or of the UN or World Meteorological Organization or some other place? And any thoughts on that? So 2 questions.
Okay, so first on the impacts. One of the interesting things about marine cloud brightening is that you can only do it in certain places where the clouds are just on the point of forming or not forming, because you can't make clouds in dry air, and there's no point in making clouds in wet air because it'll be cloudy already. So it's naturally a process that occurs at the margins of where such clouds would form naturally, and those are restricted areas. And interestingly, some of the most important ones are on the west coasts of the major continents. So, for example, off the coast of California or Southern Africa, and or South America. And one of the features of all of those areas is that they have deserts just inland of the marine areas where you might be able to enhance clouds. And one of the things that happens if you change local weather patterns in a systematic way, you're liable to shift the areas where you have precipitation and evaporation. So I think it's very likely that major marine cloud brightening off those western coasts would have impacts, and I don't know which sign they would be, but they would have impacts on the rainfall and evaporation in the desert areas just inland. So that's the sort of thing I have in mind. And I think those would need to be assessed very, very carefully indeed. And the ecological environment and the social impacts of those changes would have to be known with very good confidence before one would be brave enough to try anything like that on a large scale for any long period of time. So, you know, moving, you might also, in a less systematic way, if we come up into, say, the North Atlantic, one of the things that impacts our climate in Europe is the location of the jet stream and the storm tracks. Where do the storms go? And one of the things you would do with persistent regional cooling is probably shift those storm tracks. And that means that the depressions and the big storms associated with them might hit the UK instead of Iceland, or Iceland instead of the UK, or Spain instead of the UK. So there could be very patchy but systematic effects on climate through the localized weather patterns that would need to be understood before you really got into this sort of activity. And I'm going to bounce the where to discuss all this question, because I would say if I really wanted to discuss that in detail, Janos, I'd probably come and ask you, because you know a lot more about that international process than I do. But I do think, you know, as a complete ignoramus in this area, I would say, why not reconvene the Rio conference and take a look at how comprehensive the coverage of the environmental treaties is, and fill in some of the gaps, or something like that. But then I know nothing about it.
Maybe there'll be an opportunity in 2022 with the 50th anniversary of the Stockholm conference. Let's just keep that in mind. But Anna Maria, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, if you were looking for a universal, almost constitutional like treaty similar to the Law of the Sea Convention, this sort of umbrella treaty. I think really the only place to hold those negotiations would be through the UN General Assembly, which is the sort of only broadly representative body of countries, and certainly that's how negotiations for the Law of the Sea convention were launched, and other treaties of this kind of status. So that would be my answer. But there are a multitude of international or intergovernmental organizations and also treaty bodies with relevance to this topic, and certainly they would have to be at the table as well.
Okay. All right, let's move on. There are a couple of interesting points here. We can come back later, but I'd like to turn to Louise now. And Louise, you've heard quite a bit about what has, there are some negative issues that arise here potentially with the use of Marine Cloud Brightening, and they raise many questions. Yet we had a very interesting event in Australia, in your country, where experiments took place on Marine Cloud Brightening. And it seems that there was not much noise about it. There was not much in the news. It just happened. So why was that? Why was there no public debate, pro or contra, whatever? But maybe you could say a few words about that, and also to look at what was the overall political, economic context in which this was happening. That might help us to understand how the reaction went. So over to you.
Oh yeah, so I think the timing of the
We can hear you. It's good.
Okay. I think the timing of the experiments was actually really unfortunate. It was basically in the middle of a global pandemic, so obviously the entire media during that period was completely consumed with that, which is why there was no media coverage of it. I think it would be wrong to assume that because there was no public debate at the time that there's no public concern about these techniques. So the project team themselves actually did a comprehensive survey of Australians, and they actually found through that research that the majority of Australians thought that marine cloud brightening actually posed greater risks than it did potential benefits. So I think that kind of is indicative of the level of public concern on these issues. But as you say, there's not really been a public debate on this. And those opinions were actually very similar to key stakeholders. So as part of the project, they actually interviewed 24 key stakeholders. So with a stake in the reef. So we're talking about tourism operators, environmental groups in the area, fishermen, those kind of people. And they actually strongly cautioned against the overemphasis of a costly, misguided techno-fix at the expense of more holistic approaches. So basically threat reduction approaches, such as actually tackling the root causes of climate change. So we're really concerned that despite this really clear feedback from stakeholders, they've still chosen to go down this path. So if you actually look at the project materials, they pay lip service to designing solutions in conjunction with key stakeholders, but it's very clear to us that there's actually been no modification to the project plan as a result of this feedback from stakeholders. They've just gone ahead and done this experiment in the middle of a pandemic with absolutely no public consultation and no consultation with key stakeholders, particularly Indigenous donors in the area. So yeah, we're obviously really concerned about the ethics of that. Another of our major concerns is with the actual origins of the project in the first place. So people might not know, but this project was actually funded by a $444 million grant by the federal government, which was basically given, there was a Senate inquiry which concluded that that basically there was no tender process, there was no due diligence, and that the Senate inquiry actually reached the conclusion that they should actually cease the agreement with the Great Barrier Reef Foundation, which was actually set up by 3 fossil fuel industry executives. So it's got very shady beginnings. And I'm not sure how familiar people are with the politics in Australia, but we've got a federal government that's very closely aligned to the fossil fuel industry. And we're concerned that the false techno-fixes such as this basically just serve that narrative that we can have business as usual, we can continue burning fossil fuels, but we can still save the reef at the same time. When if you actually look at the science behind these techniques, it actually suggests that there's a very real danger that these techniques won't work at all. So even prominent advocates of geoengineering, such as Ken Caldeira, have actually raised questions about whether it's actually going to be effective marine cloud brightening on the Great Barrier Reef at all, because the impacts are typically quite dispersed, and obviously, as John's pointed out as well, there's a very real risk that it could affect rainfall in nearby areas as well. So that could actually result in increased runoff, or conversely, it could result in decreased rainfall in the wet tropics, which would be catastrophic, obviously, for tropical rainforests.
Thank you, Louise. I have just 2 specific questions to you, and the third one, which I would hope maybe all of you can look at or respond to. But first, in terms of you said that there was a clear feedback from the stakeholders, these 24 stakeholders, that the risks were considered to be higher than the benefits. So which particular risks versus, of course, the benefit would be the quote unquote saving the Great Barrier Reef, right? So can you just say a few more words about what that is? Then secondly, and it's just linked to that, that's why I want to mention it right away, is that the question of timescale. Has there, in that discussion, was it discussed the timescale of the long-term interventions needed to fix the source of the problem versus the potential quote-unquote quick intervention through marine cloud brightening? And I come to my third question afterwards. Why don't you go ahead, these 2, because that's enough.
Yeah, I'm afraid that's not actually clear from the project team materials. So they've published a summary document on their website that refers to the results of their public surveys, but they've not actually gone into any detail in terms of what potential risks they discussed and potential benefits. But I think, I mean, they acknowledge themselves that the uncertainty. Oh, sorry. The project team actually acknowledged. Oh,
now we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. The project team actually acknowledged themselves that there's a huge uncertainty as to whether these techniques will work at all. Whereas we already have proven techniques to tackle climate change. I would argue that climate change is actually a political problem rather than a technical one. And what's lacking is the political will to actually tackle these problems and for governments to basically take on the fossil fuel industry and decouple themselves from their funding and everything that comes along with that.
So then I'd like to just come to the third question, which is to all 3 of you. But it seems that this technique, marine cloud brightening, we don't know if it's going to work in any case, right? And of course, one might need to have experiments to find out whether or not it will work. But if it might not work, and if we really have to fix the problem, not the impact as such, should we be talking at all about this issue, or is this okay to talk about the issue so that we can find better ways to move forward on this or other ways to contribute to the solution of the climate crisis. Any thoughts from you, Louise, to start with? But John, Anna Maria, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think as Anna Maria's already alluded to, I think talking about governance of marine cloud brightening obviously brings with it an assumption that this technique will be adopted and that it's broadly desirable to do so. And I think, as Anna Maria pointed out, we still need to have the public discussion about whether we should ever be using these techniques. And unfortunately, yeah, as has been mentioned, scientists have already effectively jumped the gun by doing these experiments without actually having a public discussion. And I think the concern is, as both John and Anna Maria have already mentioned, is that if rogue actors like this continue to do these experiments in a patchwork kind of way, then there could be far-reaching consequences. So I think that's why it's actually really important that we have an international discussion. And I think that the UN is the appropriate place to do that. And we already have a de facto moratorium on geoengineering through the Convention on Biological Diversity. And I think that's probably an appropriate forum to have these discussions. That forum called for a precautionary approach to geoengineering, and also, yeah, a moratorium on geoengineering experiments, except when they're done in a controlled setting, which obviously experiments in the open air on the open seas, I would argue, is not a controlled setting. And it's possible that these experiments might not have transboundary effects, but we've got several quite close neighbors. We've got Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, and theoretically, yes, these experiments could actually impact rainfall and weather patterns in these regions. And we know so little about climatic systems that it's actually very hard to predict what the potential consequences of these experiments could be, which is why it's vital that we have an international discussion on these experiments before any more experiments are conducted.
John, you also had your hands up. Are you still, yeah?
Well, I agree with some of what Louise says, and I disagree with some of it too.
That's good.
We definitely do need international discussions, and I would be horrified if anybody were planning to do anything on a large scale for a long time without that. But I think at the moment it would be premature to have a major international discussion because we simply don't know enough about it. You know, we all understand that it's not clear whether this technique works or not. And so I think we need more knowledge about it. And the extent of knowledge about all of these techniques at the moment is so sparse, so patchy, that there are very few people who actually have enough of a knowledge base to engage in a proper and sensible and useful discussion about it. So I would argue for maintaining the increase, some experiments, some research, a lot of modeling, maybe some experiments in the field, are progressing on a small scale at the same time as we consult with stakeholders, because a lot of discussions with stakeholders, people find it very difficult to discuss things they have never heard of, they don't understand. They want the whole thing to be explained, and they want a lot of elaboration before they're prepared to come to an opinion. Or if not, then they're coming to an opinion based on prejudice rather than information. And I think it would be very dangerous to rule out any of these techniques on principle before we understand whether or not they're any use to us. It's very likely that research will show that these techniques don't work properly, they're too expensive, the side effects are too serious, and therefore, thank you very much, we don't want to do them. On the other hand, there is just the possibility that they might be useful. And I disagree with Louise that just tackling emissions is enough. As a number of people have pointed out, there's a long tail to climate change. Even after we've stopped emissions, the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is going to stay at well above natural levels for many thousands of years, not a few decades, many thousands of years, and with climate impacts that go with that. And it's a big if we want to do anything to maintain climate at anything like past levels, then we almost certainly have to do carbon dioxide removal, as you mentioned in your introduction. And if that is not enough, then it is possible that we might want to consider some of these SRM techniques. So I see no reason to rule them out just because they might have bad effects as well as good effects. We all understand that. Let's find out what the effects are. Let's increase the knowledge base, particularly in the government circles where international discussions would take place, and particularly in the developing world where the impacts, both positive and negative, are most likely to be felt, before we dive in and try and set up international treaties that regulate them. But having said that, as you yourself pointed out, if we want a UN law of the atmosphere, it might take a few decades to get it. So there's no harm in talking about it and thinking about it and planning for it as to whether or not it would be a good idea well in advance of actually trying to do it.
Okay, I think Anna Maria, you had your hand up a couple of times. So please do, and then Louise. And just before you get going, I would like to remind our participants to ask questions. I see one that is beginning to be there, so we'll be looking at them in a little while. But in the meantime, please post some questions. So Anna Maria, go ahead.
Yeah, so I would say that there's been this sort of ongoing governance before experiments, or experiments and then work out the governance. And then I think there's a large middle that says we need to work this out in tandem. And so I do believe that we need to have a more robust societal conversation about these techniques. I also think concrete experimental proposals or even experiments themselves tend to trigger these conversations, and they're obviously also controversial, but we've been having, I mean, it's not like this is a new topic. This has been going on, like reaching back before the 2009 Royal Society report on geoengineering. So and the question is, have we made a lot of progress? I do think, however, that the Australian example shows that we need already at this stage some set of principles and procedures that sort of frame up what is a good way to do research on geoengineering, what are best practices. And so Louise has raised issues about transparency, getting information, the way in which public participation took place, what's the nature of the interests involved, so potential conflicts of interest and so forth. And so that's one potential aspect of this conversation. But there's another question about more broadly about responsibility and the diffusion of responsibility and the moral issues of where you have a government funding research into SRM. And I'm not pointing fingers at Australia because I don't think Canada is any better on climate mitigation, but you know, like a major coal exporter in the world that doesn't have a very ambitious climate policy at all, protecting, you know, a tourist site and there are like moral implications to a country with one of the highest per capita emissions in the world, like protecting its own without considering what impact this will have on other countries, those most vulnerable to sea level rise and droughts and floods. And so That's another level of this conversation, and I think this has to take place at multiple sites, at multiple levels, not just the international level, but also, you know, within communities where these experiments are taking place and so forth. And so there's not one place, because this is obviously a really complex, multi-locational topic. Climate is like that.
Thank you, Anna Maria. Louise, you also had your...
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to John's point that his argument that we should research the technology. I just wanted to point out that there's a huge opportunity cost associated with that. So, I mean, we've got a unproven technology that there's no guarantee it will work. It could have major adverse effects, and yet that money, the hundreds of millions of dollars that our federal government's investing in that, could be used to rapidly transition to renewables. We could be promoting agroecology, building up soil carbon, reforesting. I mean, there's a whole raft of different approaches that we could use that are proven that don't pose the same potential risks as geoengineering. So I'd be really, encouraging the use of those techniques before we embark on uncontrolled experiments with our global climate.
Yeah, Anna Maria, you want to come back?
A timeline with research that has to be considered. So research takes time. I think the other issue is when we're talking about risks to coral reefs, the threshold of 1.5 degrees or even below is already the point at which we lose a great portion of our coral reef systems. And so we're very short on time in terms of protecting these really important marine ecosystems. So we have to also put it in that context as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I think just on threats to corals, I mean, that's the other concern with these experiments is there's a whole raft of other threats to corals with obviously ocean acidification being a major one, which is also linked to climate change, and these experiments will do absolutely nothing to tackle that very real risk to the reef as well. And I think I just wanted to go back to the main driver of this, and the main promoters of these techniques are actually the fossil fuel industry. So if you look at the biggest donor to the Great Barrier Reef Foundation is actually BHP, which is Australia's largest greenhouse gas emitter. And there's a raft of other fossil fuel companies that are either in advisory roles to the foundation or donors. So I think it's that political context is really important. It's very convenient of those companies. They can give money to the Great Barrier Reef Foundation, claim to be saving the reef whilst continuing to pump out enormous greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that really needs to be exposed in start relief, the real drivers of this research.
Okay. John?
That may be true of this particular Australian experiment, but I don't think that is true of this type of research in general. So we shouldn't damn the technique because of a particular situation in a particular part of the world. But the general point I wanted to make was that I was not for one moment suggesting, and I don't think anybody is suggesting, that we should research these techniques at the expense of doing all the other things that Louise mentioned. That's a false dichotomy. We need to do all of these things. The climate change problem is sufficiently serious that I believe that we need all possible positive responses to it that we can think of, and we need them as soon as possible. This might just possibly be useful at some point. It would be good to know whether it would be useful or not before we get to a situation where somebody wants to try it. Simple as that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the concern is in Australia, the federal government's doing none of the things apart from this. As Anna Maria has pointed out.
That is reason for not doing one good thing if you're not doing a lot of other.
Obviously we disagree on whether it's actually a good thing to be trying or not. Yeah.
But one important point, which is perhaps not the topic of this particular Campfire Chat, but it's important that you can't isolate these things on their own. Marine Cloud Brightening and somewhere else, emission reductions, and somewhere else something else, because in fact one needs to look at these together to make sure that in fact one does the best for the country, for the region, for the world, and so on and so forth. But let's not get lost in that one. Maybe that's for another Campfire Chat. What I'd like to do now is just to look at one question that we actually have on our Q&A tab, and Silvia Ribeiro of the ETC group has asked something of why the panel isn't discussing the CDB decisions and its virtual moratorium on most geoengineering techniques, end of her quote. And she says that as consensus decisions, do they not carry more weight and significance than other reports and academic debates? Now, Louise, you mentioned yourself the CBD decision. So in fact, it has been mentioned. Is it, what is your view about the importance of this CBD decision? Is it really a de facto or virtual moratorium, or what it is? Is it guidance to countries? And how would that impact this particular experiment that took place? Maybe starting with Louise and then Anna Maria, but John, you're welcome to have your
thoughts. I would certainly argue that it is a de facto moratorium, and there would be an expectation that countries would respect that moratorium. So I would argue that the current experiments are in clear breach of that moratorium, because there are exemptions for small scale experiments that are done in controlled settings. But as I've already said, this is open air experiments. This isn't a controlled setting. And actually it's impossible to do experiments of this nature in a controlled setting. And there's a very real possibility that this experiment could impact on other regions.
Anna Maria, any thoughts on that?
Yes, so I'm just pulling up some notes here. The Convention on Biological Diversity has adopted a series of COP decisions, so Conference of the Party decisions, also starting within their scientific body framework evaluating some of these approaches. So the sort of most significant one, or the one that's been discussed the most at least, is decision 1033. But I would say as a starting point that, well, COP decisions are legally non-binding. The chapeau, or the heading in that sort of precedes this particular paragraph of the decision, I think it's paragraph 8X or something, I can't remember, but invites parties to consider it, uses highly attenuated language, and the drafting of this particular provision has been quite criticized by some. At the same time, it does, although not legally binding, establish the idea that until we know more about these techniques, that we shouldn't be going out and deploying these techniques. And it also sets out certain principles and requirements that should guide this. I also think it has to be read in the context of the other COP decisions. And so there is also a more recent decision from, I believe, 2016, which notes that more transdisciplinary research and sharing of knowledge among appropriate institutions are needed in order to better understand the impacts of climate-related engineering on biodiversity and so forth. And so, yeah, I think there are some who would try to say that this is a ban, constitutes a ban on research, and I think the answer is clearly no from a legal standpoint, both on the literal wording of the text, but also the context of other decisions, and also the fact that it's not legally binding. But it certainly provides some level of instruction, and the CBD has probably done some of the most work on tackling these issues within the context of the protection or conservation of biodiversity. So it provides useful guidance, but I think more is required.
John?
Yeah, I think Anna Maria has said most of the things that I might have said. And of course it does, because it's the CBD, it does specifically refer to geoengineering that may affect biodiversity. And I guess you can say, of course, well, everything may affect biodiversity, so it covers everything. But even if you did, you get into the same discussion that Louise mentioned as to, you know, was it small scale? Was it conducted under controlled conditions? What does that actually mean? And blah, blah, blah. So I would say that it is very useful in the sense that it advises a very high level of precaution, as does the rather similar provisions of the London Dumping Convention in relation to marine geoengineering. There is a provision for research that is transparent and conducted under appropriate conditions. And I think the issue of transparency here is vital, and several people have mentioned this already. The last thing we would want, I think, is for this sort of research to be carried out in secret by the fossil fuel companies, for example. And transparency will not be aided by a moratorium, because a moratorium would simply encourage people to go away and do things in secret. It's much better to have all this out in the open, as transparent as possible. And I don't know enough about the particular Australian experiment to say whether they achieved a high level of transparency or not. But that is what we should be aiming for. And I think Anna Maria earlier alluded to appropriate guidelines for how research should be conducted. And the Oxford Principles, of course, set this out almost 10 years ago in what I think was a very sound manner of the things we should be striving for. And that is good guidance, but trying to shut down research before you have any idea whether it is likely to have positive or negative impacts is, I think, the wrong way to proceed. Research in a controlled manner with a lot of discussion, and as Anna Maria said, in parallel with public discussions and public knowledge exchange and knowledge building, is a much better way to go in the long run than trying to set this up as a battle between the mad scientists and the people, which includes most of those scientists who really want to preserve the environment on Earth for people and all the other things that live in it.
I got Anna Maria and then Louise reacting, so please go ahead, Anna Maria.
Yeah, so we do have, as John has mentioned, high-level principles. For example, the Oxford principles, the Silomar, just some high-level abstract principles, and one of those is the idea of transparency. But and maybe I'm plugging my own work here, but I do think we need to elaborate that guidance in a more specific way, and also develop procedures for how researchers and governments and others that engage in this kind of research. And a good example is the idea of transparency. And so we do have this idea that we need transparency, but as Louise has pointed out, and the Australian experiment took place under a regulatory framework related to Australia's marine environment in the Great Barrier Reef. So there were like legal or regulations that applied here at the national or domestic level. There are many different kinds of ways to satisfy the requirement of transparency. And so I think the researchers would probably say we use best practices. We have a little blurb on our website and so forth. But then I think Louise is asking, can we have more information? This is the kind of information we want. And so one of the recommendations in the 2009 Royal Society report is the idea of a code of practice or code of conduct for research that could guide this and elaborate on some of these high-level principles that we've seen, for example, by academics at Oxford and elsewhere. And so this would be something that maybe would be a next step project that could many different actors could engage in developing. And yeah. but this is something that I've researched extensively. So this is my opinion. I think probably others have different opinions about this.
I'm glad you brought forward your opinion, because I was going to ask you at some point anyway, so this is good. Thank you. Louise.
Yeah, I mean, I think all this discussion about codes of conduct and governance, as I've probably already said, it kind of gives the implication that the use of these techniques are inevitable and we just need to regulate how they're used. And I think that's a step too far. We still haven't had a proper societal discussion on whether we should be using these techniques at all. And I think prior informed consent is essential before any more experiments like this are done. Now, certainly the project proponents in Australia have paid lip service to best practice public engagement. They say that they're working with traditional owners, so Aboriginal communities, but there's over 70 different Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities with connections to the reef. So there's absolutely no way that they've consulted with them all, and they've admitted that they've done very limited public engagement and discussion around specific interventions, including marine cloud brightening, and yet they've still gone ahead and done these experiments. So I think, and they're planning to scale them up. So they're talking about doing four times the area next year, and then ramping up to 10 times the area the following year, which would be a 400 square kilometer radius, which is, I mean, that there's absolutely no way that could be regarded as a small experiment. And given how little we know about the potential climate impacts, so as John's already mentioned, there's been modeling that showed that I think they reckon that there'd be a 23% reduction in rainfall in the Amazon as a result of marine cloud brightening, were it introduced globally, and other modeling suggests that there could actually be I think it was a 27% increase in sort of runoff, which, were that to occur in Queensland, could obviously have catastrophic impacts for water quality in the reef as well. So I would argue that we just shouldn't go there at all. We've already got proven techniques to tackle climate change. Why do we need to invest millions? And you, as I've already said, the main drivers of these techniques are the big fossil fuel companies. They want to continue with business as usual. This is a convenient techno fix for them to basically continue with business as usual. And I would argue it's a red herring. It's a smokescreen.
Okay. I'd like to stay in the research area a little bit, but maybe from a little different angle. I've heard people say before that marine cloud brightening is basically just weather modification. And it's not geoengineering. Now, we have a World Meteorological Organization that has actually done a lot of work on weather modification, including quite a bit about how to transparently bring information together, coordinate research and activities and things like that. So is that applicable to this? And should we look at the WMO as a potential governance mechanism in this area? Okay, Louise.
I would argue it's very clearly geoengineering. I mean, and anyone that argues otherwise, it's just an excuse to allow them to do the research. It's quite clearly an attempt to modify the climate, and that's why we need an international agreement before any more experiments like this go ahead. Okay.
Any other perspectives on that? Yes, John.
Well, if you do it once, it's weather modification. And if you do it persistently for 10, 30 years, then it becomes climate modification. So I think, again, it's one of these semantic questions. I do think from a technical point of view, the WMO, the way the WMO deals with weather modification is highly relevant to marine cloud brightening. But it's not so relevant to stratospheric aerosol injection. And I do think, I mean, we're talking about marine cloud brightening today, but to me, that is just one of the possible suggestions that is floating around there, not necessarily the most attractive from the first principles at all. And I would like to see a discussion rather than on specific techniques. I would like to see discussions around the whole complex of techniques. Mm-hmm. And what Louise says about this being used as a fig leaf by the fossil fuel companies, of course, that is true. I'm sure the fossil fuel companies would love business as usual if they could get it. But I think everybody who's ever looked at this would conclude that continuing to burn fossil fuels and trying to use solar radiation management to counteract that would be a very bad plan indeed. So as far as I'm concerned, techniques like this are right at the bottom of the list of tasks in order, some of which Louise has already mentioned. But nevertheless, we may get all the way down that list and find that we still haven't done enough. So there's no harm in spending a modest amount of money in researching these things to know whether or not we should take it off the list altogether or leave it on for some time in the future.
Okay. All right. Then I'd like to go back to something that John, you mentioned earlier on, and about the challenging, the situations in which one could potentially explore marine cloud brightening. You can't do it everywhere. And from those criteria and from studies we have seen, it does appear that many of the places would be offshore from pretty close to least developed countries. Mm-hmm. Now, in reality, most of the discussion is taking place in the global north at the moment, and even the distinguished company we have around the screen reflects that. So the question sorry, Louise, Australia is not global north, but it is in a way. So, it's down and under in the global north. But how can we engage the least developed countries in this discussion, whether or not, and if yes, how, and if not, why not, and how do we do this? Any thoughts from any of you, either of you? Yes, John?
I mean, that's precisely why I'm co-chair of this organization called the SRM Governance Initiative, whose objective is precisely to increase the knowledge base in the less developed parts of the world so that people from those parts of the world can play a proper role in any discussions that do ensue on this subject. This is something that, I feel very strongly about indeed, that this is not something that should be discussed by people from the north and the most developed countries. But in order to have a sensible discussion, there has to be the knowledge base. So we have to build the knowledge base, the understanding from the ground up. And that is very difficult. It's going to take a very long time. And we are trying in a very small way to do our bit to promote that. And I think it needs an awful lot more of that, of engaging people in discussions, engaging researchers from the least developed world in such projects, which we are doing through our Decimals project, which has a handful of projects going on all around the less developed world, precisely in order to begin to address this question. But there is so much to do. It is going to take a very long time, and we need to do much more of it. And then hopefully we can, all sit around a table without the power structures that exist at the moment, but everybody talking from a common base, preferably, hopefully, with a common understanding of the advantages and disadvantages of not just this technique, but a whole bunch of other techniques too.
Louise?
Yeah, I think you raise a really good point, Janos, because just as the global south is really disproportionately wearing the impacts of climate change, our concern is also that they're going to disproportionately where the impacts of geoengineering experiments as well. So if you actually look at the people that are driving the geoengineering experiments, they're predominantly white, they're predominantly male, they're predominantly privileged, and reflect a worldview that this is a technical problem that can be fixed, which I think is really problematic. It's basically, it was this kind of engineering approach that actually created climate change in the first place. So the idea that we can use the same approach to get ourselves out of climate change, I think, is extremely problematic.
Okay, then I'd like to go back to we have at least one participant who is very attentive and listening to our conversation. Thank you, Sylvia, and she put another question, Sylvia Ribeiro, on the question board, and it's something we have addressed, but maybe we need to come back to this just to have another round. Is that she's saying that the problem with your proposal, John, and I'm reading the question here, to advance experiments before UN governance, is that it will make the techniques ready for those with the resources and power to use them. And I think we've addressed some of this. As it has happened with all powerful technologies, once the investments are there, the pressure to continue with more and larger experiment research will be heavier until they come to deployment. In other words, the famous slippery slope argument. Can we have a quick round of that and address that? It's an important issue. So who would like to start?
Well, I'll have a go.
Okay.
I think, that really is an argument from despair, because if it is really true that it is impossible to prevent doing something that we know how to do, even if we think it's a bad thing, then, humanity is doomed. I'm an optimist about humanity, and I would like to think that if we do know about something and we can conclude that it is an unqualified bad thing, then we would decide not to do it. Now, nuclear weapons would be a case in point. There has not yet, and I'm touching wood, been a major nuclear war, although it is now 50, 60 years since that could have happened. So I think there are grounds for being optimistic that humanity is intelligent enough not to do stupid things once it knows they're stupid. And unless we assume that, then I don't know where we go.
Okay.
Well, I mean, we've known about climate change for 40 years now, at least. Obviously, I mean, the atomic bomb was dropped. So, I don't know. Yeah.
Anna Maria.
Maybe I don't share your optimism, John.
I mean, I think experience gives us reason to be pessimistic about how we've managed these kinds of situations in the past on climate. So I guess I'm sympathetic, but I also think that I agree with Sean that we know about issues of technological lock-in and slippery slopes, and there is research on this. And so the question is, can we do it better? Can we manage this in an informed way that tries to stave off powerful interests co-opting these technologies and promoting certain kinds of interests that are against maybe what is in the broader public interest? And I'm not sure, but I think we have to be a little bit more robust in the way we examine these issues and develop our approach. We can't just sort of write it off and that's the end of it. So I think caution is warranted, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do something.
I mean, I think, given limited resources, though, I would argue that there are already a whole range of proven approaches to tackling climate change, but it's not actually the technical solutions that are the problem. It's the lack of political will, and it's yeah, basically the huge vested interests that exist in continuing to burn fossil fuels that are blocking a pathway to actually tackling climate change. And I don't think that pursuing technical approaches like this are actually going to deal with those really deep systemic problems. So I've got very little optimism that, going down this pathway is actually going to help tackle the problem at all. It's actually just going to further entrench those vested interests.
I mean, technical issues is a bit of a, and sorry, I don't mean to like pick a fight. There's a bit of a false dichotomy in the sense that renewable energy is also a kind of technical fix as well. And so the issue here isn't really that we're opposed to technological solutions, but certain kinds of technologies with certain kinds of moral and ethical and legal and social and political and economic implications. And so I think we again have to be a bit more precise in how we discuss what the issues are beyond just sort of we're against techno solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, by all, I mean, we're absolutely not opposed to technology, and there's some very good appropriate technologies that I believe are going to be a really core part of solving this problem. The issue with geoengineering is it is uncontrolled, and we do have a very limited understanding still, unfortunately, of climatic systems. And yeah, we have only one climate. We've already done a good job of messing with it, and I think further experiments in that realm are potentially extremely dangerous. And the brunt of the adverse effects could be potentially borne by the global south again. So if there are droughts, has been predicted by modeling, if there is reduced rainfall or increased rainfall in some regions, then obviously it's the global south that will be least prepared to deal with those potential impacts and are going to be disproportionately affected by them.
Okay. John?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to a previous point because in fact the reason we have a problem with climate change is because engineers back in the 19th century discovered that coal was a high energy source and they could make machines work with coal. And they genuinely didn't know back in the 19th century that it would have adverse climate effects. And so it was precisely the development of technology without knowledge about its possible impacts that led to the problem that we find ourselves in when we are technologically locked in and well down the slippery slope, simply because people were ignorant at the time. If they had known what we know now, they might very well have decided that burning coal was not such a good idea at all. So I think the argument that we should remain in a state of blissful ignorance is fundamentally wrong.
Okay, so we're getting to the end. We'll have to close in time. Maybe what we have left is if any of you would like to share with us another 20-30 seconds worth of sort of key thoughts that you will go away with from this discussion. We have time for that, and then we'll have to wrap up. I will have to finish. So 20-30 seconds worth of something that is really important for you. Okay, John. Go ahead, John.
No, well, I would just say that I have a long list of things that I would like to do and like to see done in relation to climate change. And it starts with all the things that Louise mentioned, renewable power and afforestation and all of those things. And it goes on down. And geoengineering techniques are way at the bottom, and solar radiation management comes below carbon dioxide removal on my list of tasks in order. And marine cloud brightening comes near the bottom of that list. And the only thing that is further down the bottom of the list is actually ocean fertilization, which is my absolute least favorite. I think Marine Cloud Brightening is my second least favorite technique for dealing with all of these. But that doesn't mean I don't think about it. But I do think we need to recognize that we should start at the top of the list with things we know how to do, where we can be reasonably confident that the effects are going to be overwhelmingly positive, and work our way down until we've got the situation to where we want it to be.
Okay, Louise, you had your quick reaction there.
I just thought it was important to stress that we really can't ignore the political context in what this is all happening. And in our particular context in Australia, we basically have a climate denying government that's wedded to the fossil fuel industry. And unfortunately, this is the only thing that they're really investing in. So they've said that they've announced that they're going to have a gas-led recovery from COVID. And the renewable energy industry doesn't need any support apparently, because they're going really great already. So yeah, it's highly problematic, which is obviously why we're concerned that they're pumping all this money into what we consider a false solution, because we believe that there's other proven solutions that are much more likely to have tangible impacts on tackling climate change.
Thank you, Louise. Anna Maria, last words quickly.
This conversation has really impressed upon me that we need to proceed with this conversation, and further research should it take place in a more structured way. And so I think a priority should be elaboration of governance for research in particular, as a way of sort of controlling or providing parameters and procedures for who can have a seat at the table and have this discussion. And so elaborating best practices for research is, I think, really quite important, as also a foil for groups like NGOs like Friends of the Earth to say, like, this is not, they have not told us what we need to know if we're going to evaluate, like, who's leading this research and what are their motivations and so forth. So I think governance is really important for research, rather than just going ahead on it in an ad hoc manner, which is what we've seen to date. So proponents designing their own experiments and governance for them, I think, is not appropriate.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all three of you, and also to our participants for your questions. And with this, we have to end, but we'll continue the discussion. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.